Okay guys, now what we're going to be working on is adding value to the iris of this eye grid. I'm going to be using a 2B pencil now for value adding, and what I'm going to start with is actually the pupil is the darkest value, that's probably about a 5, and the ring around the iris as well is about a 5. So what I want you to first notice though, this ring, the inner part of it, it actually has some type of like wobbliness to the line. It's not just so rounded like I originally put it in there. So I'm going to continue to observe the photo and kind of just wobble out this line a bit. Again, it doesn't have to be exactly to what you're seeing. It gets a little thinner in the left corner. So just kind of giving that a little bit more of a wobbly line with a 2B pencil. So around this inner ring of the iris, I'm going to shade it just a full pressure 5 value. So I'm just filling this in. You're going to do the same with the pupil. The iris is probably the hardest part to shade because there's a lot of different texture, there's a lot of different linear movement that happens in there. I'm going right up to where that border hits the top of the eye outline. Again, just pushing pretty solid for the dark value. Gets thinner right about here. So the outer ring is pretty smooth, but the inner ring has this bit of like wobbly line to it. So you're just going to fill that in pretty solid. You're going to take your Q-tip. You're going to just kind of fuzz it out just a bit, just to give it that softer look. It's okay if it smears in here. If the smear is going to happen, let it smear on the inside of the iris. Try not to smear too much on the outer ring because this is your eyeball. So we want to keep that white. So for the inside of your pupil, you're going to leave that little ring of white that's in the top. And you're going to fill this inner pupil again with a 5 value as well, just aside, leaving that little ring of white in the top right. Okay. Doing a video. So fill it in with a pretty decent coat. Take a Q-tip, just kind of fuzz over it a little bit to get rid of those pencil lines. Leaving that white. You can go a little bit over that white circle as well, just to kind of give it more of a like middle value, so it's not so white. And then before you get into the rest of the iris, you're going to take your eraser and just erase those grid lines that are inside, because this part we don't want grid lines anymore. So you always got to make sure in the gridding process that you erase your grid lines before you start. It didn't matter here because the value is going to be so dark, but now for the remainder of this, we want to make sure it's clear of grid lines so we can just focus on adding value. So now what happens in the iris portion of the eye, it kind of gets this like sun ray, like bike, like the spindles of a bike inside. It gets that kind of like linear circular motion, but there's like 3 rings of value. It's always darker by the pupil, and as it gets towards the outer ring, it gets lighter. So what I want you to do first is with you're still doing a 2B pencil, you're going to create this kind of like as if the pupil is a sun. I'm leaving space. I'm pushing probably like medium pressure. I'm not going all the way. I'm not going all the way lengthwise. I'm kind of going to a small range here. And I'm going to go around this circle about 4 times, just doing that same repetitive motion, just to kind of build up the value. Same pressure, just going around. So this is my 3rd ring around. And I'll go 1 more time. So that's for the darkest value around the pupil. Now what I'm going to do is go a little further out. So I'm still going to start from the pupil, and I'm going to go around now for my medium value. this time I'm only going to go 2 times around this ring. But now I'm just extending the length of the line a little bit. So I go around once, then I'm going to just overlap again one more time. Okay, so that's for that medium value ring. Now I'm going to still start from the pupil and go all the way, extending all the way now. This time I'm only going around once. So I'm kind of filling in the gaps, full extent from pupil to outer ring border, just one time. So this inner dark ring, I went around 4 times. This middle ring, I went around 2 times. And the last ring, full length, I went around once. Now I'm going to take my Q-tip, and I'm going to do the same motion from the pupil out, and I'm just going to kind of coat over this, all of it, in the same kind of spindle, sunshiny ray motion. I'm going to do this twice. So just to kind of like get rid of a lot of that whiter, like white kind of spaces that are happening in some spots. So that's like the base coat of the iris. If you notice in the picture though, there's a darker value that's happening up top because of the shadow of the eyelid that's coming under, and down here gets a little bit of a whiter value. So if you wanted to just do like one more coat, just half of it, just for this top, full range, just to darken up the top half, you could do that. Still doing this kind of like spindly thing. Again, I'm only doing it from the top half, the iris. The bottom portion of the iris, I'm actually going to take my eraser. You can see I still left some white, more white down here because of that fact that there was more white. But if you see like very white sections, you could go back with your eraser as well and kind of like create some of those lighter sections also to kind of bring the lightness towards the bottom, bring the darker up the top. So last thing I'm going to do now to finalize this iris is actually do some of these like, again, these lines that are kind of like sun rays, but now I'm going to go from the pupil and I'm going to push hard from the pupil and then ease up on the line as I go. So I'm going to kind of like create like this one last, so these are full length from the pupil all the way. This is kind of the last step to make this look as realistic as it can. So I'm kind of just adding the final. So if you look at the iris in the picture, you'll notice that there's very like these like hair-like, some of them are even curved a little, and there's values in here that you can go back and add if you wanted. If you are going to pay very close attention, if you want to copy this even better, you just remember that when you're adding any values, you're kind of using this very linear, jagged sun ray kind of motion to do that. So I'm just going to continue adding that last layer of these like kind of like the way you would do tree branches. You push pretty hard at the source of the branch and then you kind of ease up. If you feel like your pupil lost some of its darkness, you could always, from all the smudging, you could always go back and add another coat in there. You want this to be fairly dark. You also want this ring around to be fairly dark as well. If you wanted also around the edge of this darkness, you could do like a small kind of jaggedy pull off of that ring as well, just to kind of finish off this spindle effect from the dark ring that's going around. So this is pretty much it. This was like the fastest way to do an iris to make it look as realistic as possible. Okay, so it was like a multi-step, a lot of base coating and a lot of movement in this like spindly way. That's pretty much for the iris. We're going to now continue on with the rest in just a minute.